I arrived at my wedding venue to find the iron gates locked tight. The venue was dark and empty. My mother-in-law had canceled the contract 5 days earlier without a word to me, taking the entire $150,000 deposit with her. 240 of my guests were already on their way. What I did in the next 30 minutes made the local news. My name is Gabby, and at 31 years old I thought I was marrying the love of my life. Instead, I found myself standing on the sidewalk in a custom wedding dress, realizing I was about to go to war. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to in-laws who completely underestimated your worth. The crisp October morning air cut right through the delicate silk of my Vera Wang gown. I stood on the cobblestone driveway of the Piedmont estate, staring in absolute disbelief at the heavy steel chains wrapped tightly around the gilded iron gates. The sprawling mansion behind the gates was completely silent. There were no florists unloading centerpieces. There were no caterers setting up the champagne tower. There was only a cold, empty courtyard. My bridal party stood frozen behind me, holding their bouquets in stunned silence. The venue manager, a woman named Sarah, stood on the other side of the gate, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. She looked terrified to even make eye contact with me. "I am so deeply sorry, Miss Hayes," she said, her voice trembling in the quiet morning air. "The event was officially canceled last Tuesday. Your mother-in-law Vivian came in person with the finalized power of attorney paperwork. She formally terminated the contract and withdrew the entire $150,000 deposit." My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I refused to let a single tear ruin my makeup. I had paid for 80% of this wedding using the profits from my crisis public relations firm. I built my business from the ground up, working relentlessly to become the top crisis manager for the Atlanta elite. But against my better judgment, I had allowed Vivian to put her name on the master contract as the primary financial contact. Julian had begged me to do it. He told me his mother was old school society and simply needed to feel respected. He promised me it was just a formality to keep the peace. I thought I was extending an olive branch to a woman who had spent the last 2 years treating me like a charity case just because I grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of the West End. Instead, I had handed her the exact legal weapon she needed to humiliate me on the most important day of my life. Sarah shifted uncomfortably behind the iron bars. "Miss Hayes," she continued softly, "Vivian instructed us not to reach out to you. She claimed Julian was handling the communication because the wedding was being downsized and relocated to a more suitable and private venue, the Heritage Country Club." Hearing that name made my blood run ice cold. The Heritage Country Club was a hyper-exclusive establishment where Vivian served on the board. It was also a place notorious for its strict guest policies and elitist environment. Suddenly, everything made sickening sense. Vivian did not just cancel my venue, she hijacked my wedding to filter out my side of the family. My phone began to vibrate wildly in my hand. It was my wedding planner, frantic and panicked. She was parked just 2 blocks down the street with a fleet of luxury charter buses carrying my family. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, and my childhood friends who had flown in from all over the country to celebrate with me. These were hard-working people who took time off from their double shifts just to afford their plane tickets. These were the exact people Vivian always whispered about at dinner parties, referring to them as loud and unrefined. I declined the call and gripped the phone tightly in my palm. I turned my attention back to the venue manager. "Did she leave any other instructions, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the folder tighter. She said the new guest list was strictly capped at 50 people, only immediate family and select corporate partners for Julian. She explicitly said your extended guest list would not be permitted past the security gates at the country club. A sharp gasp escaped from my maid of honor standing behind me. But I did not gasp. I did not scream. As a crisis manager, I was trained to strip emotion from disaster and focus entirely on the solution. Julian, my supposed protector, knew about this. The man who proposed to me on a private yacht, swearing he would always defend me against his family. Toxic respectability. Politics had stood by and let his mother lock my family out of my own wedding. The man whose law school loans I had helped restructure. The man who I thought loved me for my ambition and my grit had chosen to cower behind his mother. This was not a miscommunication. This was a calculated and brutal strike to remind me of my place. Vivian wanted to erase my roots completely and mold Julian into the perfect society husband with a quiet, obedient wife who would just smile for the cameras and write the checks. She thought I would be too embarrassed to fight back. She thought I would collapse on the pavement in my expensive dress and quietly send my family back to the airport in shame. She assumed I would walk down the aisle at her country club with my head bowed, simply grateful to be accepted into her prestigious family. She was wrong. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. I reached up and carefully unpinned the heavy diamond veil from my hair, handing it to my sister. Then I popped the trunk of my limousine and pulled out my laptop, resting it right on the hood of the car. The countdown had officially begun. I had 30 minutes to secure my family dignity and absolutely destroy Vivian's carefully crafted illusion. I was not going to let them win. I built my life on handling the impossible and turning it into a victory. They had no idea who they crossed. I dialed Julian number first, ready to hear his pathetic excuses. The phone rang twice before he picked up, and through the speaker I could hear the faint sound of a saxophone playing a smooth jazz melody. He was indoors somewhere warm and comfortable, while I stood shivering on the concrete in my wedding dress. "Hello, babe," he answered, his voice low and cautious, like he was trying to calm a nervous animal. He did not sound like a man who just discovered his wedding venue had been canceled. He sounded like a man who had known all along and was just waiting for the inevitable explosion. I did not greet him. I looked at the heavy chains on the gate and asked him very quietly why I was standing outside a locked estate while my entire family was sitting in charter buses 2 blocks away. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The smooth jazz continued playing mockingly in the background. "Gabby, listen to me." He started his tone, taking on that patronizing edge he always used when he was trying to explain something he thought I was too emotional to understand. Mother and I had a long talk last week, and we realized the Piedmont estate was just too massive, too chaotic for the kind of elegant, intimate ceremony we really need right now. I repeated the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We as in you and me, or we as in you and Vivian?" He let out a frustrated sigh. "Do not do this, Gabby. Do not make this a fight." Mother secured the Heritage Country Club for us. It is the most exclusive venue in Atlanta. You know how hard it is to get a weekend booking there. She pulled a lot of strings to make this happen for us. It is going to be beautiful, just 50 of our closest friends and family. A private, refined evening. I stared at my reflection in the dark, tinted window of the limousine. 50 people. Our original guest list was nearly 300. I asked him directly what he expected me to do with the 240 guests who had traveled across the country to watch me get married. "What about my aunts who cooked for us every Thanksgiving?" I asked. "What about my cousins who helped you move into your apartment when you had nothing? What about the people from the West End who supported my business before anyone else gave me a chance?" Julian lowered his voice, dropping into a hushed whisper. "Gabby, be reasonable," he pleaded. "You know how your extended family gets when they are all together. They are wonderful people, but they can be a bit overwhelming. They are loud. The Heritage Country Club is a very conservative, traditional environment. My senior partners from the law firm are going to be there. The partners who are deciding on my promotion next month. Mother just felt that having hundreds of people from your neighborhood mixing with the firm executives might create the wrong image. We have to think about my future. Our future. It is just for the aesthetic, babe." The aesthetic. My heritage, my family. The people who shaped me into the woman standing here today were nothing more than a liability to his corporate aesthetic. He was talking about my family as if they were an embarrassing accessory he had to hide in the closet before the important guests arrived. This man had eaten at their tables, laughed at their jokes, and let them treat him like a son. But when it came down to standing beside them in the light of day, he chose to hide behind his mother, pearl necklaces, and country club memberships. I realized in that moment that Julian did not want a partner. He wanted a prop. He wanted a black woman who was successful enough to look good on his arm, but disconnected enough from her roots to never make his wealthy white associates uncomfortable. I asked him if he had any intention of telling me this before I showed up at the gate. He stammered, claiming they wanted to surprise me with the upgrade and that Mother was supposed to handle the logistics. He was lying. He was a coward who let his mother do his dirty work because he could not look me in the eye and tell me he was ashamed of where I came from. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dead calm, "you let your mother steal my money, cancel my venue, and lock my family out of my wedding. You thought I would just cry and take a car to your country club and say thank you." There was silence on the line. I knew him well enough to know he was nodding. He truly believed I loved him so desperately that I would swallow my pride and abandon my family just to have his ring on my finger. "I am so sorry you feel blindsided," he whispered, sounding genuinely convinced that he was the victim of my stubbornness. "Just tell the buses there was a logistical error. Send them to a nice restaurant in the city. I will pay for their meals. Just please get in a car and come to the Heritage. The ceremony starts in an hour, and Mother is already stressed." "Mother is stressed," I repeated. I closed my eyes and let the raw, blinding anger solidify into something sharp and precise. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply told him I would see him very soon and hung up the phone. I did not tell him that I had absolutely no intention of sending my family away. I did not tell him that the crisis management skills I used to destroy corporate scandals were about to be weaponized against his own mother. My maid of honor touched my shoulder gently, asking what we were going to do. I turned to face her, feeling a cold smile form on my lips. Before I could answer, a sleek silver Porsche pulled up onto the curb right next to my limousine. The passenger door opened, and a pair of expensive Italian leather shoes stepped out onto the pavement. It was Trent, my future brother-in-law, the white hedge fund manager who had made it his personal mission to remind me at every family dinner that I did not belong in their world. He adjusted his designer sunglasses and looked me up and down with a smirk that made my blood boil. The real confrontation was just beginning, and I was more than ready. He slammed the car door shut and walked toward me with a slow, deliberate stride that screamed entitlement. Trent was the kind of man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. He was married to Julian's younger sister Vanessa, and from the moment we met, he made it painfully clear that he viewed my presence in the family as a glitch in their perfect social matrix. He stopped a few feet away from me, adjusting his cuffs, and looked at my wedding dress with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Well, this is a tragic sight," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer any false sympathy. He just stood there looking at me like I was a problem he had been hired to clean up. "Mother-in-law sent me to do damage control," he continued, leaning casually against the side of my rented limousine. "She figured you might make a scene, and we really cannot afford any embarrassing viral moments today. So let us handle this like adults, Gabby." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. He uncapped a heavy gold pen and quickly scribbled across the paper, resting it on the hood of the car. He tore the check out and let it flutter down onto the glossy black paint right in front of me. I looked down at the piece of paper. It was made out to me for $10,000. "Consider that a parting gift," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Take the money, Gabby. Pay off your vendors. Buy yourself a nice vacation. And most importantly, use it to send those loud relatives of yours back to the West End where they belong." He gestured vaguely down the street toward where my family was waiting in the charter buses. "You and I both know they were never going to fit in at the Heritage Country Club anyway. They would just embarrass themselves, and frankly, they would embarrass Julian. It is better for everyone if you just take the loss and walk away quietly." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the cold morning air. He was looking at me, waiting for my spirit to break. He expected me to snatch the check and run away crying. He expected me to crumble under the weight of his white arrogance and their old money cruelty. But I did not cry. I did not even blink. Instead, my mind clicked into the icy analytical state that made me the most feared crisis manager in Atlanta. I set a mental timer for exactly 30 minutes. 30 minutes was all I needed to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I looked at the $10,000 check, and then I looked back up at Trent. I knew things about him that even his own wife did not know. In my line of work, you hear whispers before they become headlines. I knew his boutique crypto hedge fund was currently bleeding millions of dollars. I knew the Securities and Exchange Commission had been quietly subpoenaing his business partners for the past 2 weeks. He was standing here trying to buy my dignity with $10,000 while his entire financial life was built on a crumbling foundation of fraud. But I was not going to play that card yet. I was going to let him dig his grave a little deeper first. You think $10,000 is enough to make me disappear? I asked, my voice eerily calm. Trent sighed, rolling his eyes like I was a child throwing a tantrum over a toy. Look, Gabby. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You played the game well. You got the ring. You almost got the name. But you never belonged with us. Vivian knows it. Vanessa knows it. Even Julian knows it. He just did not have the spine to tell you himself. So take the money before we have to involve security and make this truly humiliating for you and your people. I slowly reached out and picked up the check from the hood of the car. Trent smirked, thinking he had won. He thought money was the ultimate silencer. I held the crisp piece of paper between my fingers, feeling the heavy, expensive texture of it. Then, without breaking eye contact, I ripped it in half. His smirk vanished instantly. I put the torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the little pieces of paper fall like snow onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. I do not want your dirty money, Trent, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. And you are right about one thing. I do not belong with your family. I am entirely too good for them. I turned my back on him and walked over to the open window of my limousine where my driver was watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. Tell the wedding planner to start the buses, I instructed the driver. We are not going home. We are going to the Heritage Country Club. Trent stepped forward, his face flushing a furious shade of red. Are you insane? He barked, dropping his calm, collected facade. If you show up there, Vivian will have you arrested for trespassing. It is a private club, Gabby. You cannot just force your way in with a mob of your relatives. It will ruin Julian's career. It will ruin the whole weekend. I paused at the door of my limousine and looked back at him. The 30-minute timer in my head was ticking down. I smiled a cold, sharp smile that sent a visible shiver down his spine. Then Vivian better call the police, I said smoothly. Because 240 of my closest friends and relatives are on their way to crash her private little party. And trust me, Trent, you will want to be there for the grand finale. I climbed into the back of the limousine and shut the heavy door, severing the conversation. Through the tinted glass, I watched Trent pull out his phone, frantically dialing what I could only assume was Vivian's number. He was pacing back and forth, looking less like a wealthy master of the universe, and more like a panicked animal caught in a trap. The engine of the limousine rumbled to life beneath me. Down the street, the heavy diesel engines of the charter buses roared as they pulled away from the curb. We were a small army dressed in formal wear, moving with precision toward the heart of the Atlanta elite. I sat back against the leather seats and smoothed the skirt of my wedding gown. They thought they could lock me out. They thought they could erase me. They were about to learn that you never try to outplay the woman who writes the rules of the game. The heavy tires of the limousine rolled over the cobblestone as we pulled away from the gates of the Piedmont estate, leaving Trent standing there in his bespoke suit, looking like a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine. I pressed the button to roll up the privacy partition, separating us from the driver. My sister sat across from me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She asked me if I was really going to crash my own wedding at a private country club. I told her I was not crashing anything. I was simply relocating my guests to the venue that my mother-in-law had so graciously selected for us. I picked up my phone and called my wedding planner, Marcus. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with panic. He asked what the new plan was and if he should start issuing refunds to the vendors. I told him there would be no refunds and no retreats. I instructed him to lead the caravan of 4 charter buses directly to the Heritage Country Club. I told him to tell the drivers not to stop at the security gate, but to pull straight through to the main roundabout. Marcus hesitated, reminding me that the Heritage had armed security and a strict guest list policy. I told him I was well aware of their policies and that he needed to trust me. I had spent my entire career managing disasters, and this was just another Tuesday for me. I ended the call and leaned back against the plush leather seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment. The smooth hum of the engine beneath me felt grounding. My mind drifted back to the early days long before I wore custom Vera Wang and rode in chauffeured limousines. I remembered the agonizing ache in my feet after working double shifts at a diner in the West End just to pay for my public relations degree. The smell of stale coffee and fried food used to cling to my clothes, no matter how many times I washed them. I remembered the nights I stayed up until 3 in the morning drafting press releases for small local businesses on a laptop that was constantly overheating. I did not have a trust fund or a wealthy mother to open doors for me. I had to kick the doors down myself. When I started my crisis management firm, nobody took a young black woman from a working-class neighborhood seriously. The corporate elites of Atlanta laughed at me when I pitched my services. They told me I did not have the pedigree to handle their high-stakes scandals. But they soon learned that pedigree does not fix a collapsing stock price or a federal indictment. I built my reputation by taking on the cases no one else wanted to touch. I worked relentlessly outsmarting the old boys club at every turn until they had no choice but to hire me to save their own reputations. I became the person the city wealthiest families called when their perfect lives were about to shatter. People like Vivian and Trent were exactly the type of clients I dealt with every single day. They were arrogant, sloppy, and overly reliant on their money to hide their mistakes. They thought their bank accounts made them invincible, but I knew exactly how to dismantle their armor. Julian used to say he admired my drive. When we first met, he told me he loved how fearless I was. He said he wanted a partner who was an equal, not just a trophy. But as the months turned into years, I realized he did not want my strength. He just wanted to leech off it. He wanted my connections to get him interviews at prestigious law firms because he had failed his bar exams 3 times. He wanted my financial stability so he could maintain his lavish lifestyle without actually putting in the work. And most of all, he wanted me to shrink myself whenever we were around his mother, so her fragile ego would not be threatened by a self-made woman. I had spent years making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. The limousine merged onto the highway, the caravan of buses following closely behind us, like a protective shield. My sister reached out and squeezed my hand, asking if I was okay. I looked out the tinted window, watching the skyline of Atlanta blur past. I told her I had never been better. For 2 years, I had bitten my tongue and swallowed my pride to keep the peace in a family that actively despised me. I had politely smiled through backhanded compliments from Vivian about my hair and my neighborhood. I had gracefully ignored snide remarks from Trent about my background. I had done everything right according to their impossible standards, and they still tried to lock me out in the cold. But the cold was where I thrived. The cold was where I built my empire. I opened the folder on my laptop and reviewed the documents I had prepared. The screen glowed in the dim light of the limousine, illuminating the legal paperwork that was about to turn the country club fantasy into a waking nightmare for Vivian. I double-checked the power of attorney documents and the corporate registry files. Everything was perfectly in order. The trap was set, and they had walked right into it without even realizing it. We exited the highway and turned onto the winding, tree-lined road that led to the Heritage Country Club. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees looked idyllic, the perfect backdrop for an exclusive society wedding. But there was a storm brewing, and it was riding in 4 massive charter buses. I could see the imposing wrought iron gates of the country club approaching in the distance. A lone security guard stood inside the gatehouse, completely unaware of the chaos that was about to descend upon his quiet Saturday shift. I took a deep breath, letting the anger dissolve into cold, hard focus. It was time to go to work. The four massive charter buses pulled smoothly past the wrought iron gates of the Heritage Country Club. The lone security guard stepped out of his booth, waving his hands frantically, but my driver simply rolled down his window and flashed the all-access vendor pass Marcus had procured. The guard lowered his radio, looking confused as our heavy vehicles bypassed the checkpoint and began the slow climb up the winding driveway. The country club was an intimidating fortress of old Southern money. White columns supported a massive portico, and luxury cars were neatly lined up by the valet stand. As our caravan came to a halt right in front of the grand entrance, the valets froze. They had never seen charter buses blocking their pristine circular driveway. I stepped out of the limousine first, my silk Vera Wang gown brushing against the immaculate pavement. My sister stepped out behind me, followed by my aunts, uncles, and cousins pouring out of the buses. We were a vibrant, beautiful wave of black joy and resilience, stepping onto grounds that were historically designed to keep us out. My family was dressed to the nines in jewel tones and sharp suits, laughing and adjusting their ties, completely unaware of the hostility waiting inside. Marcus, my wedding planner, hurried to my side, asking for the signal. I simply nodded toward the heavy mahogany double doors. I walked up the wide stone steps, and the valet staff parted like the Red Sea. The moment the heavy doors swung open, the lively chatter of my family spilled into the cavernous marble lobby of the Heritage Country Club. The contrast was immediate and deafening. Inside the lobby, a string quartet was playing softly in the corner. 50 elite guests were gathered, holding crystal flutes of champagne, murmuring in hushed, polite tones. They were Julian senior law partners, hedge fund managers, and old money socialites carefully curated by Vivian to reflect her ideal world. The moment we stepped inside, the string quartet faltered, playing a jagged off-key note before stopping entirely. 50 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in their drinks. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My relatives stopped their laughing, realizing they had walked into a space thick with tension. But I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the quiet room. From across the room I spotted her. Vivian was wearing a pearl-colored silk suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her neck dripping in diamonds. The glass of champagne in her hand trembled slightly as she took in the sight of my 240 guests, filling her exclusive sanctuary. For a split second, genuine panic flashed across her face. But Vivian was a master manipulator. Within seconds, she smoothed her features into a mask of wounded panic. She handed her glass to a passing waiter and rushed toward me, her heels tapping rapidly against the stone floor. She did not greet my family. She did not even acknowledge my sister standing right next to me. Vivian grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into my skin, and pulled me slightly away from the crowd. She plastered a fake tight smile on her face for the benefit of the watching socialites, but her eyes were cold and furious. "Gabby? What on earth are you doing?" she hissed in a loud whisper, designed to carry just far enough to make me look unreasonable. "This is a private event. You are causing a scene and embarrassing everyone." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm and calmly told her to let go. Vivian released me but stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me. "I tried to spare your feelings, Gabby," she whispered dramatically, bringing a hand to her chest like a martyr. "I really did. I knew you would not understand the delicate nature of Julian's career. His senior partners are standing right over there, the men who hold his entire future in their hands. You bringing this loud mob of people here is completely destroying his reputation." She looked past me at my aunts, who were quietly standing together, looking uncomfortable under the glaring eyes of the country club members. "Look at them, Gabby," Vivian continued, her voice dripping with pity and condescension. "They do not belong here. This environment is too sophisticated for them. I changed the venue to protect you from this exact embarrassment. I thought you would have the grace to accept a smaller, dignified ceremony, but instead you act like a child throwing a tantrum. You are proving every single doubt I ever had about you." She was deploying classic gaslighting. She stole my money, canceled my venue, locked my family out, and now she was standing in front of 50 wealthy strangers trying to convince me that she did it for my own good. She wanted me to feel crazy. She wanted me to look at my own family and feel shame. She wanted me to believe that my mere presence in this building was an act of violence against her son's future. Vivian leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous low tone. "If you truly love Julian, you will turn around right now and take these people back to whatever neighborhood you dragged them out of. Do not force him to choose between his career and a woman who refuses to learn her place." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me without absorbing a single drop. I did not raise my voice or defend my family. I did not need to. I knew she was playing to the audience of her wealthy friends, trying to paint herself as the put-upon mother dealing with an unhinged bride. She was waiting for me to snap, to start yelling so she could point her finger and say she was right all along. She was banking on the angry black woman stereotype to do the heavy lifting for her. But I was a professional. I dealt with corporate psychopaths who tried to spin narratives every day. Vivian was just an amateur playing in my arena. I looked at her directly in the eyes and offered a slow, chilling smile. "I am not here to ruin Julian's reputation." "Vivian," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, carrying just enough volume for the front row of her guests to hear. "I am here to enjoy the wedding reception I paid for. The one you so generously relocated to this beautiful property, using my $150,000. Vivian's face went completely pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had not expected me to bring up the money in front of her friends. In her world, money was something you had but never discussed out loud. Talking about stolen deposits in the middle of a country club lobby was the ultimate social sin. Before she could recover and spin another lie, a voice cut through the heavy silence. It was Julian walking briskly across the marble floor, his face flushed with embarrassment and panic. Julian moved through the crowd of wealthy onlookers with hurried, frantic steps. His tuxedo looked immaculate, but his face was a portrait of sheer terror. For one brief, foolish second, a tiny part of my heart dared to hope. I thought the man I had agreed to marry was finally stepping up. I thought he had seen his mother cornering me and decided that enough was enough. I waited for him to stand beside me, to take my hand, and tell Vivian that my family had every right to be there. Instead, he did not even look at me when he reached us. He looked past me, staring at my aunts and cousins with wide, panicked eyes, as if they were a disease that had just infected his perfect sanctuary. He grabbed my elbow with a grip that was entirely too rough and dragged me a few steps away from Vivian. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne hit my nose, making my stomach churn. "Gabby, what the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice trembling with contained rage. "You are completely out of control right now. You need to get these people back on those buses and leave before you ruin everything." I stared at him, letting his words ring in my ears. I asked him if he was seriously taking his mother's side after she stole my money and hijacked our wedding. I reminded him that the people standing behind me were my family. The same family that had welcomed him into their homes and fed him when he was a struggling law student. Julian shook his head aggressively, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair. "This is not about them, Gabby," he pleaded, dropping his voice even lower. "This is about my life. My managing partner is standing right by the bar watching us. Do you have any idea how long I have worked to get into this circle? You cannot just march a mob in here and turn this place into a circus." My mother was right. You are letting your emotions destroy my future. He looked me up and down, taking in my custom wedding dress and the cold fury in my eyes. Instead of backing down, he leaned in closer and delivered the final blow. "Please, Gabby," he whispered, his tone dripping with a toxic mixture of pity and disgust. "Just for one day, stop acting like you are still in the projects. Act like you belong with me and fix this." The air in the lobby seemed to vanish. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing. The silence between us stretched out, feeling heavy and suffocating. "Stop acting like you are still in the projects." The words echoed in my mind, bouncing off the cold marble walls of the Heritage Country Club. This was the man I had loved. This was the man whose debts I had paid, whose career I had salvaged, whose fragile ego I had nurtured for years. And in the end, he saw me as nothing more than a girl from the hood who needed to be disciplined and hidden away so she would not embarrass his wealthy white colleagues. The last thread of my restraint snapped. The careful, measured crisis manager I had been playing all morning evaporated, leaving behind something much more dangerous. The polite, respectable facade I had maintained for the sake of his family shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Any lingering affection I had for Julian died right there on the polished stone floor. I pulled my arm out of his grasp so violently that he stumbled backward. He looked shocked, like he could not believe I had physically rejected him. He opened his mouth to say something else, to issue another command, or offer another cowardly excuse, but I did not let him speak. "You think this is about your future, Julian?" I asked, my voice no longer a whisper. I let the volume rise, letting it carry across the lobby so the 50 elite guests could hear exactly what kind of man was standing in front of them. "You think my family is a circus? My family paid for the suit you are wearing right now. My family supported you when you failed the bar exam for the 3rd time and came crying to my apartment because your own mother told you that you were a disappointment." The hushed murmurs of the country club members suddenly grew louder. Julian's face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. He frantically waved his hands, shushing me, begging me to keep my voice down. "Gabby, please shut up," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly toward his managing partner, who was now staring at us with raised eyebrows. But I was done being quiet. I was done shrinking myself to fit into their narrow, prejudiced world. I took a step toward him, backing him up against a massive floral arrangement. "You want to talk about acting like we belong?" I continued, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Let us talk about how you belong, Julian. You belong here because I made the phone calls to get you that junior associate position. You belong here because I paid off the credit card debt you racked up trying to impress these people. You are standing in a country club pretending to be a titan of industry when you are nothing but a frightened little boy hiding behind your mother-pearl necklace." Vivian let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing a hand to her chest. "How dare you speak to my son that way?" she cried out, stepping forward to defend her golden boy. "You are an unhinged, hysterical woman." I did not even look at her. My eyes remained locked on Julian, watching his pristine image crumble in real time. He looked like a terrified child. He had spent his whole life relying on the protection of his name and his mother money. But right now, none of it could save him from the truth. He had pushed me too far. He had insulted my blood, my roots, and my sacrifice. He thought he could put me in my place, but he had only succeeded in reminding me exactly who I was. I was the woman who fixed messes. And right now, Julian and his entire toxic family were the biggest mess I had ever seen, and I was about to clean them up permanently. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could shatter the crystal chandeliers above us. My family stood tall behind me, a silent army of support, watching me take back my power. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the exposure of his own incompetence. The golden boy had been stripped of his armor and left shivering in the cold reality of his own making. I felt a deep, settling calm wash over me. The heartbreak was gone, replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. The demolition had officially begun, and I was going to make sure there was nothing left but dust. The managing partner of Julian Law Firm, a tall, imposing man named Richard, slowly stepped out from the crowd of silent onlookers. His eyes darted between Julian and me, his face an unreadable mask of corporate calculation. Julian saw him approaching, and absolute panic washed over his features. He tried to step in front of me to physically block me from Richard's view, but I neatly sidestepped him. "Mr. Davis," I said, addressing the managing partner with a polite nod. "I apologize for the interruption to your Saturday afternoon." Julian let out a strangled noise, grabbing my wrist again, but Richard held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. "Let her speak!" Richard commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a man who billed $1,000 an hour. Julian dropped my wrist, stepping back as if he had been burned. I smoothed the front of my gown and looked Richard directly in the eyes. "Julian has been very concerned about his reputation today." I explained, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent marble lobby. "He told me that having my family here, the people who helped raise me in the West End, would somehow damage his standing at your firm. He said I was acting like I belonged in the projects and that I needed to learn my place so I would not embarrass him in front of the partners." Richard frowned, glancing at Julian with a look of pure disdain. I could see the wealthy guests exchanging shocked whispers. They were accustomed to polite, passive-aggressive behavior, not this raw, unfiltered truth. But what Julian failed to mention, I continued, never breaking eye contact with Richard, is how exactly he managed to secure that junior associate position in the first place. Vivian lunged forward again, her face red with fury, screaming that I was a liar and a gold digger. But my family stepped up, forming a solid wall between her and me. My uncle crossed his arms, daring her to take another step. Vivian froze, trapped behind a wall of the very people she considered beneath her. She looked at the tailored suits and the dignified faces of my relatives and realized she could not bully them. I turned my attention back to the managing partner. "I am Gabby Hayes," I said simply. "I own the crisis management firm that handled the embezzlement scandal for your biggest tech client last October, the one that kept your firm name out of the federal indictments." Richard's eyes widened in sudden recognition. He knew exactly who I was. The corporate world in Atlanta was small, and my firm had saved his law practice from a public relations nightmare that could have cost them millions. "Julian told you he was a top-tier candidate?" I said, my tone conversational but lethal. "He told you his academic record was spotless. What he did not tell you is that he failed the state bar exam 3 separate times." A loud collective gasp broke out among the 50 elite guests. In their world, failure was a disease. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling uncontrollably at his sides. The golden boy armor was completely gone. He was exposed in front of the people he worshipped. He had spent the last 2 years pretending to be a brilliant legal mind while secretly crying on my living room floor every time the test results came back negative. "I called in a massive personal favor with your hiring committee," I said, delivering the final blow. "I used my equity and my professional relationships to bypass the standard background checks, because Julian begged me to save him from the humiliation of working at a public defender's office. He cried and told me his mother would disown him if he did not secure a job at a top-tier corporate firm. I bought his seat at your table, Mr. Davis. I covered up his failures so he could stand here today and sip champagne with you. And today, he had the nerve to tell me that my family does not belong here." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at Julian, who was now looking down at the marble floor, unable to meet his boss' gaze. The tension was suffocating. "Julian, is this true?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Julian opened his mouth, but only a pathetic stutter came out. "Mother, handle this," he finally choked out, looking at Vivian with pleading eyes. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. A grown man, a corporate lawyer caught in a massive professional lie, and his first instinct was to cry for his mother to fix it. Vivian tried to push past my uncle, her voice shrill and desperate. "Richard, do not listen to this hysterical woman," she begged. "She is just a bitter ex-fiancée trying to ruin him because we upgraded the wedding without her. She has always been jealous of his success. She comes from nothing. Richard, you know how these people are, they want to drag successful men down." Richard did not even look at Vivian. He kept his eyes pinned on the trembling man in front of him. "I do not care about your wedding venue drama," Vivian, Richard said coldly. "I care that a junior associate at my firm lied about his bar exam attempts on his application, an application that I personally signed off on because I was told he came highly recommended by Miss Hayes." Richard turned back to me, his expression softening just a fraction into one of professional respect. "Miss Hayes, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. We value integrity above all else at our firm. He looked back at Julian. Do not bother coming into the office on Monday. Julian, we will have your belongings mailed to your mother house. You are done. The words landed like a physical blow. Julian's knees actually buckled slightly and he had to lean against a marble pillar to keep from collapsing. The country club guests began whispering frantically, pulling out their phones to text the scandal to everyone in their social circles. The very people Julian had abandoned me for were now actively participating in his downfall. I stood there surrounded by my loud, beautiful family, feeling absolutely nothing for the man sobbing quietly against the pillar. He had traded my loyalty for a seat at a table that just publicly kicked him out. But Vivian was not done. The loss of her son's prestigious job was a fatal blow to her social standing. But instead of accepting defeat, she doubled down on her rage. Her carefully curated society image was burning to the ground, and she needed someone to blame. Her face twisted into an ugly snarl as she looked around the lobby, realizing her perfect exclusive event was completely ruined. She locked eyes with Trent, who had been standing silently near the back, watching his brother-in-law get destroyed. "Trent!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me and my family. "Call the police right now. Tell them we are being harassed and threatened by a mob of trespassers. Tell them they are getting violent. I want every single one of them dragged out of here in handcuffs. I will not let these people destroy my family." Trent immediately pulled out his phone, a malicious grin spreading across his face. He was thrilled to have a reason to weaponize the law against us. The real war was finally escalating, and they had no idea they were marching straight into a trap I had already set. Vanessa stepped forward, pushing her way past her devastated brother. She was shaking with a mix of fear and outrage, her expensive silk dress rustling as she planted herself right in front of me. She looked at my family with undisguised disgust before turning her venomous gaze back to me. "You think you are so clever, Gabby," she spat, her voice shrill and echoing in the massive lobby. "You think coming in here and ruining Julian makes you powerful? But it just proves what we knew all along. You are nothing but a classless thug in a custom gown. You can buy all the expensive clothes you want, and you can start a little public relations business, but you will never wash the West End off of you. You and your whole family are just trash, trying to force your way into a world where you do not belong." I let her words hang in the air. I did not flinch or look away. Vanessa had always been the quiet one, the pampered little princess who let her mother do the heavy lifting when it came to insulting me. But seeing her brother publicly destroyed had finally pushed her to drop the polite society mask. She was showing her true colors, and it was a thoroughly ugly sight. My sister shifted next to me, her hands balling into fists, but I put a gentle hand on her arm to stop her. We did not need to fight them. They were doing a spectacular job of destroying themselves. Behind Vanessa, Trent had his phone pressed to his ear. The malicious grin on his face had hardened into a look of cold, calculated cruelty. I could hear the faint voice of the emergency dispatcher on the other end of the line. "Yes, I need police at the Heritage Country Club immediately," Trent said, his voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. He was not whispering. He wanted us to hear him. He wanted to instill terror. "We have a highly volatile situation here," he continued, his tone shifting perfectly into that of a concerned, law-abiding citizen. "A large, hostile group of black trespassers has forced their way into a private event. They are refusing to leave and they are becoming aggressive. My family is terrified for our safety." The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. No one in my family had raised their voice. No one had made a single threatening move. We were a group of 240 people dressed in formal wedding attire, standing quietly in a beautifully decorated room. But Trent knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the power of those specific words. Hostile, aggressive, black trespassers. He was using the oldest and most dangerous weapon in the playbook. He was weaponizing the police against a group of black people to resolve a personal grievance. He fully expected that the moment the police arrived, they would look at my family and see exactly what he described: a threat that needed to be neutralized immediately. A low murmur of unease rippled through my family. They knew the reality of the world we lived in. They knew that a 911 call like that could end in tragedy. My Uncle Charles, a retired high school principal, turned to face our crowd and raised both of his hands slowly. "Stay calm, everyone," he instructed, his voice steady and soothing. "Keep your hands visible. Do not give them any reason to escalate this. We are guests here, and we will handle this with dignity." My family followed his lead, standing tall and completely unbothered, refusing to give Trent the panicked, chaotic reaction he was desperately hoping for. Trent hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "They are on their way," he announced, looking directly at me with a smug, satisfied expression. "You have about 5 minutes to get your people out of here, Gabby, before they start putting people in handcuffs. Trespassing is a serious offense, but causing a panic at a private club might just get you a night in a holding cell. I wonder what that will do to your pristine business reputation when your corporate clients see your mugshot on the evening news." Vivian seemed to draw strength from Trent's actions. She stood a little taller, adjusting her diamond necklace and looking at me with renewed arrogance. "You really overplayed your hand this time, Gabby," she sneered. "You should have just taken the $10,000 and gone home. Now you are going to be publicly arrested in front of all these important people. You wanted to ruin Julian, but you are the one who is going to end up in the back of a squad car." The 50 elite guests of the country club stood frozen, watching the drama unfold like a live theater performance. Some of them looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting their weight and looking toward the exits. Richard, the managing partner who had just fired Julian, quietly stepped back, blending into the shadows of the room. He was a smart man, and he wanted absolutely no part in a racially motivated police encounter. But others, the ones who shared Vivian and Trent worldview, looked completely at ease. They sipped their champagne, waiting for the authorities to arrive and remove the people they believed did not belong in their exclusive sanctuary. Julian was still leaning against the pillar, looking completely defeated. He did not say a word to stop his brother-in-law. He did not defend the woman he was supposed to marry, or the family that had treated him with nothing but kindness. He just stared at the floor, entirely consumed by his own pathetic downfall. His silence was the loudest betrayal of all. He was perfectly willing to let his own family call armed police on the woman he supposedly loved, just to save face. I looked at Trent. His face flushed with the thrill of his own perceived power. He thought he had won. He thought he had played the ultimate trump card. In his mind, the arrival of the police was the end of the game. But in my mind, it was just the beginning of the final act. I had anticipated this exact move. As a crisis manager, I always planned 3 steps ahead of my opponents. I knew that people like Trent and Vivian would always rely on authority figures to protect their privilege when they felt threatened. I did not say a single word in response to their threats. I did not try to explain myself or plead with them to call off the police. I just stood there, perfectly calm, radiating a quiet, absolute certainty. My silence seemed to unnerve Vanessa, who crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looking back and forth between me and the heavy mahogany doors. The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours in the suffocating tension of the marble lobby. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the hills, approaching the country club with terrifying speed. The racial and class tension in the room had hit a complete boiling point. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. But what they did not know was that the police were not coming to arrest me. They were coming to unknowingly trigger the trap door I had built right under Vivian's carefully constructed world. The heavy wooden doors of the dining room creaked open slightly as a few more staff members peeked out, drawn by the escalating chaos in the lobby. That was when Elijah finally decided to make his presence known. Julian's father had been lingering in the background, observing the destruction of his son's career with a cold, detached expression. Elijah was a man who rarely raised his voice because he believed his money did all the talking for him. He owned a string of lucrative commercial real estate firm branches across the state and carried himself with the heavy, arrogant posture of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He slowly walked toward me, his expensive loafers making absolutely no sound on the polished marble floor. The remaining country club guests parted for him, respectfully acknowledging his status as the patriarch of this toxic family empire. He stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space just enough to be physically intimidating, but keeping his hands casually clasped behind his back. He looked at me with eyes that were entirely devoid of warmth or empathy. "Gabrielle?" He said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that was meant to project absolute authority. "You have made your point. You have embarrassed my son, and you have upset my wife. But this little crusade of yours ends right now." He glanced down at his heavy gold Rolex watch and then looked back up at me. "You have about 3 minutes before those police cruisers pull up to the front doors. If you and your people are not back on those buses by the time those officers step into this lobby, I am going to make it my personal mission to destroy your life." I did not blink. I let him continue pouring out his venom, giving him enough rope to hang himself. Elijah leaned in closer, so only I and the first row of my family could hear him. "I know exactly how much your public relations firm is worth," he whispered menacingly. "I know who your biggest clients are, and I know which corporate boards they sit on. I have a massive team of corporate lawyers on retainer who bill more in a single month than you made in your first 5 years of business. If you force my hand today, I will instruct them to bury your little company in so much frivolous litigation that you will be completely bankrupt before the holidays. I will call every contact I have in the Atlanta business community and make sure you never secure another contract in this city. I will bleed you dry in legal fees, and when you have nothing left, I will take your personal assets too. I will make sure every news outlet in the state runs a story about how an unhinged woman tried to extort my family and crashed a private club. He was trying to trigger my deepest insecurities. He knew how hard I had worked to build my business from scratch. He knew that for a Black woman from the West End, financial independence was the ultimate shield against a world that constantly tried to tear us down. He was threatening to strip away the only armor I had and send me back to the poverty I had fought so desperately to escape. This was the ultimate psychological warfare. He was not screaming or throwing a tantrum like Vivian or Vanessa. He was calmly and clinically outlining my financial execution. He thought the sheer weight of his wealth would crush my spirit. He expected me to look at the flashing red and blue lights that were beginning to reflect off the tall windows of the lobby in panic. He expected me to calculate the odds of a Black woman winning a legal war against a wealthy, connected businessman and surrender. But Elijah had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed my business was vulnerable because he assumed I played by the same conventional rules he did. He did not realize that a crisis manager thrives in the exact high-pressure environment he was trying to use to terrify me. I looked at the man who was supposed to become my father-in-law and felt nothing but profound pity. He was a dinosaur trying to use outdated intimidation tactics on an asteroid. "Elijah," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational volume that somehow cut through the rising tension in the room. "Your lawyers are certainly expensive, but they are also lazy. If they had actually done their due diligence on my firm instead of just glancing at my tax brackets, they would have warned you not to have this conversation with me." Elijah's jaw clenched slightly. He was not used to being dismissed by anyone, let alone a woman he considered entirely beneath his social class. "Do not test me, little girl," he sneered, dropping the polite facade entirely. "The sirens are getting louder. You are out of time. Walk away before you lose everything." I turned away from him, deliberately showing him my back in a supreme display of disrespect. I looked at my family. My 240 guests were watching me closely, waiting for my cue. They heard the police sirens just as clearly as I did. The wailing sound was echoing off the hills, wrapping around the country club like a tightening noose. My family knew the historical danger of armed police arriving at a scene where wealthy white people were claiming to feel threatened by Black presence. The fear in the room was palpable, and it was entirely valid. But they also knew me. My aunts, who had scrubbed floors and worked night shifts so I could buy textbooks in college, did not flinch. My cousins, who knew exactly what it meant to be racially profiled, held their heads high. I caught the eye of my Uncle Charles and then looked at my sister. "Do not move an inch," I told my family. my voice carrying strong and clear across the lobby. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks to the officers when they come through those doors. You let me handle everything. We are not running away, and we are certainly not bowing down to people who steal from us to protect their fraudulent lives. My family stood their ground. Shoulders squared and jaws set, they formed an impenetrable wall of solidarity behind me. Not a single person turned toward the exits. Their absolute trust in me infuriated Elijah more than anything I could have possibly said to him. He realized in that exact moment that he had no power over these people. His money meant absolutely nothing to a community that had survived for generations on loyalty and resilience. He could not buy our submission, and he could not threaten us into making ourselves invisible. Outside, the deafening wail of the sirens abruptly cut off. The flashing red and blue lights strobed wildly through the massive glass doors of the country club, illuminating the horrified faces of the elite guests in harsh alternating colors. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed from the driveway outside. The police had arrived. Vivian let out a triumphant gasp, clutching Trent's arm in eager anticipation. Julian finally looked up from the floor, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. Elijah stepped back, crossing his arms and waiting for my imminent arrest. The heavy mahogany double doors began to swing open, and the psychological warfare was about to become very physical. But my pulse was perfectly steady. The trap was primed, and the arrogant hunters were about to step right onto the trigger I had been patiently waiting to pull. The heavy mahogany doors were thrust open with such force that they hit the marble walls with a loud crack. 5 police officers stepped into the lobby, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They were led by the local sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a stern expression. His eyes swept the room expecting to find a violent riot or a mob of dangerous criminals based on the frantic emergency call his dispatcher had received. Instead, he was met with the sight of 240 beautifully dressed black men and women standing in perfect silence. The contrast between the emergency dispatch report and the actual reality of the room caused the officers to physically pause. They looked confused, glancing at the string quartet instruments in the corner and then at the 50 elite guests clutching champagne flutes. The hostile takeover that Trent had described looked exactly like what it was, a formal wedding party, standing quietly in a lobby. Trent did not waste a single second. The moment he saw the badges, he snapped into action, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. He completely dropped his arrogant sneer and adopted the frantic, worried tone of a man desperate to protect his family. "Officer, thank God you are here," Trent said, rushing toward the sheriff. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "That woman right there and her people have forced their way into our private event. We asked them nicely to leave multiple times, but they refused. They are trespassing, and they have been aggressively threatening my family and our guests. We need them removed immediately." Vivian was right behind him, grabbing the sheriff's arm to demand his attention. She let out a dramatic sob, pressing her hand to her chest. "Officer, please, you have to do something," she pleaded, her voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "This is an exclusive country club, and we paid for a private, safe environment. She brought this mob here to terrorize my son and ruin his career. I want her arrested right now. Put her in handcuffs and get these people out of our sight before someone gets hurt." Elijah stepped up behind his wife, adding his deep, authoritative voice to the chorus of lies. "Gentlemen, we are prominent members of this community," Elijah said, looking at the officers with an expectation of absolute obedience. "My name is Elijah, and this is my family. We are the victims of a coordinated harassment campaign by this disgruntled woman. I expect you to clear this lobby immediately and process her for criminal trespassing." The sheriff looked from Trent to Vivian and then to Elijah. He listened to their demands, taking in the expensive suits and the diamond necklaces. Then he looked past them, locking eyes with me. I was still standing calmly at the front of my family, holding my bridal bouquet. I did not look panicked. I did not try to shout over them to defend myself. My Uncle Charles and my sister stood right beside me, radiating the same quiet dignity. We knew that any sudden movement or raised voice could be misinterpreted. The generational trauma of these encounters was real, but my family refused to let these people turn our existence into a weapon. We were letting the wealthy white country club members do all the screaming and the unhinged pointing. Trent noticed that the officers were not immediately reaching for their handcuffs. His performance started to crack, revealing the entitled rage underneath. "What are you waiting for?" Trent snapped, stepping closer to the sheriff. "I am a hedge fund manager and a premium member of this club. I pay the taxes that fund your salary. I called you to report a crime in progress. Arrest her right now, or I will make sure your supervisor hears about your gross incompetence. She is a dangerous woman from a bad neighborhood, and she is trying to extort us." The country club guests watched with bated breath. They were completely accustomed to the police acting as their personal security force. In their world, a phone call from a wealthy white man was supposed to result in immediate physical action against anyone they deemed undesirable. They expected the officers to march across the marble floor, grab me by the arms, and drag me out of the building in my wedding dress. Vanessa was already smirking, pulling out her phone to record the moment I was humiliated and taken away. She wanted to post it online to prove that I was nothing more than a classless thug. Julian was leaning against the pillar, watching me with a pathetic mix of relief and lingering cowardice, hoping the police would finally rid him of the mess he could not handle himself. The sheriff held up a hand signaling his deputies to hold their positions near the entrance. He did not look intimidated by Trent threats or Elijah name-dropping. He took a slow, deliberate step away from Vivian, gently dislodging her hand from his uniform. "Calm down, all of you," the sheriff said, his voice booming with authority. "I will assess the situation and determine who needs to be removed. But right now, I need everyone to step back and lower their voices." Trent's face turned a furious shade of red. "You do not need to assess anything," he barked, pointing at me again, his voice cracking with sheer outrage. "She is standing right there. She does not belong here. She is a trespasser. She does not have a membership and she was not invited. Arrest her right now before I call the mayor and have your badge taken away." The sheriff ignored his escalating temper entirely. He adjusted his utility belt and walked straight toward me. His heavy boots echoed loudly on the polished marble floor, sounding like a ticking clock in the silent room. The 50 elite guests held their breath, leaning forward in their expensive cocktail attire. Vivian crossed her arms, looking incredibly satisfied. She truly believed this was the end of the line for me. She thought her family wealth and status had finally secured their victory. As the sheriff closed the distance between us, my family braced themselves. My sister gripped my hand tightly, her palm sweating against mine, but I squeezed it back, reassuring her that everything was exactly according to plan. I looked at the sheriff as he stopped just a few feet away from me. He looked at my custom Vera Wang dress and then at the composed faces of the 240 people standing behind me, holding their ground with unwavering strength. The lobby was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The trap was completely set. The audience was watching, and Trent and Vivian had just handed me the match to light the final fuse. The sheriff did not stop walking. He completely ignored Trent, who was still pointing his finger at me like a petulant child. He walked right past Vivian, who was already fluffing her hair for what she assumed would be my dramatic perp walk. He bypassed Elijah, who was standing with his chest puffed out in false authority. The heavy thud of the sheriff's boots finally came to a halt when he stood directly in front of me. The entire lobby held its collective breath, waiting for the moment he would reach for his handcuffs and read me my rights. Instead, the sheriff took off his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest, and offered me a polite, familiar nod. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the room. "It is good to see you again. I am sorry your special day is being interrupted like this." I smiled warmly at him, relaxing my posture. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "I appreciate you responding so quickly to the call." The collective gasp that erupted from the 50 elite guests sounded like all the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. Trent's arm slowly dropped to his side, his smug expression melting into a mask of utter confusion. Vivian took a stumbling step backward, gripping the edge of a marble table to steady herself. Elijah's jaw physically dropped. They could not process what they were seeing. In their world, law enforcement was a tool used exclusively by their class to punish people who looked like me. The idea that the local sheriff not only knew me but was treating me with deep professional respect completely short-circuited their prejudiced minds. Trent was the first to find his voice. "What the hell is going on here?" Trent demanded, taking a step toward the sheriff. "Why are you talking to her like that? I am the one who called you. She is trespassing on private property. Arrest her." The sheriff turned to look at Trent, his expression hardening into a look of absolute authority. "Mr. Sterling," the sheriff said, his tone no longer polite, "I suggest you lower your voice and step back. You called in a report of a hostile mob threatening your life. Filing a false police report is a felony, and looking at the absolute calm of the people standing here, I would say you are already walking on very thin ice." Trent's face flushed a violent shade of purple. "False report," he sputtered, looking wildly around the room for support. "She does not have a membership here." She forced her way in. "Ask the club manager. Ask anyone. She does not belong on this property." I decided it was finally time to put him out of his misery. I reached into my white silk clutch and pulled out a thick manila folder. It was sealed with a bright red stamp from the state corporate registry. I held it up, letting the heavy silence of the room amplify the weight of what I was about to say. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Trent," I said smoothly, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "I do not have a membership to the Heritage Country Club." Vivian let out a sharp, vindictive laugh. "You hear that, officer?" she cried out, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She admits it. She is trespassing. Get her out of here." I did not look at Vivian. I kept my eyes locked on Trent and Elijah, the two men who prided themselves on their business acumen. "I do not need a membership to a club that I essentially own," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clarity across the marble lobby. The vindictive laugh died in Vivian's throat. Julian, who had been hiding by the pillar, suddenly looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Elijah frowned, stepping forward. "What kind of nonsense are you talking about?" Elijah demanded, his voice wavering slightly. "This club has been owned by the founding families for over a century. You are completely delusional." I opened the folder and pulled out the crisp legal documents. "I am a crisis manager, Elijah," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the stunned crowd. "I fix financial disasters. And this beautiful, exclusive country club of yours has been a massive financial disaster for the past 3 years. You all spend so much time drinking champagne in this lobby that you never bothered to look at the club balance sheets. The Heritage has been secretly bleeding money, defaulting on loans, and facing imminent bankruptcy." I paused, letting the reality of my words sink in. The elite guests began looking at each other, their faces pale with panic. Membership in this club was a status symbol, and the thought of it being bankrupt was a social nightmare. 2 months ago, I continued holding up the documents. A silent private investment group stepped in and bought 60% of the club debt and assets right out from under the founding families to save it from going to public auction. My public relations firm represents that investment group, and because they prefer to remain entirely anonymous, they granted me full legal power of attorney to manage their majority stake. I walked right up to Elijah, holding the red stamped document directly in front of his face so he could read the bold legal print and see my notarized signature. "I do not just belong here, Elijah," I whispered, my voice laced with venom. "I am the majority shareholder. I sit at the head of the board. I sign the checks that keep the lights on in this building. I am the boss." The silence that crashed down on the room was absolute and suffocating. The shift in power was so violent, it felt physical. Elijah stared at the document, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He was a real estate man. He knew exactly what a power of attorney looked like, and he knew instantly that I was telling the truth. The woman he had just threatened to bankrupt, the woman he had treated like a piece of trash from the West End, was the legal owner of the very ground he was standing on. Vivian began to shake, her hands trembling so violently she dropped her clutch. It hit the marble floor with a loud snap, but no one moved to pick it up. "No," she gasped, shaking her head in denial. No, that is impossible. You are lying. Julian, tell her she is lying. But Julian said nothing. He was staring at me like he was seeing me for the very first time. He finally realized the magnitude of the woman he had thrown away. He had traded a queen for a seat at a table that I actually owned. I turned to the sheriff, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction. "Sheriff," I said, my voice returning to a calm, professional tone. "As the legal representative of the majority ownership, I can confirm that my family and I are here lawfully. However, I cannot say the same for the other 50 people in this room." I pointed directly at Vivian, Trent, and Elijah. "They are holding an unsanctioned private event on my property without my permission. They have harassed my guests and they have wasted your department time with a fraudulent emergency call." The trapdoor had finally swung open beneath them. The arrogant hunters had marched blindly into my territory, and now they were the ones standing in the crosshairs. The panic in their eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My family standing behind me had not made a single sound, but the collective shift in their posture spoke volumes. My Uncle Charles stood a little taller, a proud smile finally breaking across his face. My sister gripped my arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute triumph. They had watched me swallow my pride for years, and now they were watching me swallow the entire Heritage Country Club. The 50 elite guests who had been judging my family just moments before were now scrambling to distance themselves from Vivian and her crumbling empire. They began whispering frantically, some of them already turning toward the coat check. The illusion of their untouchable wealth had been shattered by a black woman from the West End carrying a manila folder. Trent was completely speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. He looked at the sheriff, hoping for some kind of bailout, but the sheriff simply rested his hand on his duty belt, preparing to do his job. The power dynamic had completely inverted. I was no longer the uninvited guest. I was the landlord, and the eviction notice was officially being served. I turned back to the sheriff, who was standing with his hands resting casually on his utility belt. "Sheriff," I said, maintaining my professional tone, "as you can see from the documents, I am the legal representative of the majority ownership. I am authorizing my family and our guests to be here today. However, I am formally requesting that you remove the other 50 individuals from my property. They do not have my permission to host a private event here. They bypassed the proper authorization channels to book this room, and they have harassed me and my family. They are the ones who are trespassing." The sheriff looked at the documents one last time and nodded slowly, handing them back to me. "Understood, Mrs. Hayes," he replied, turning to face the crowd of elite socialites. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," the sheriff announced, his voice echoing loudly in the marble lobby. "The legal owner of this property has asked you to leave. The event you are attending is unsanctioned. I am going to need everyone who is not with Mrs. Hayes' party to collect their belongings and exit the building immediately. If you refuse to leave, you will be subject to arrest for criminal trespassing." The resulting chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The 50 wealthy guests who had spent the last hour whispering about my family and looking down their noses at us suddenly erupted into a panicked frenzy. In their pristine, perfectly manicured lives, the threat of police action was the ultimate social poison. Nobody wanted to be photographed by the staff or gossiped about at the next country club luncheon. Men in expensive tailored suits began shoving past each other to get to the coat check. Women in designer dresses hitched up their skirts and power-walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, abandoning their half-empty crystal champagne flutes on whatever flat surface they could find. Their loyalty to Vivian dissolved the exact second it threatened their own reputations. Vivian stood frozen in the middle of the room, watching her carefully constructed world evaporate. Her high society friends were fleeing from her like she had a contagious disease. "Margaret, wait," Vivian pleaded, reaching out to grab the arm of a woman wearing a heavy pearl necklace. "You do not have to leave. This is just a misunderstanding. I will call the board of directors. I will have her removed." But Margaret yanked her arm out of Vivian's grasp with a look of sheer terror. "Do not touch me, Vivian," the woman hissed, glancing nervously at the sheriff. "You lied to us. You dragged us into a legal mess. I am not getting arrested because you wanted to play games with your daughter-in-law. The woman hurried away, leaving Vivian standing completely alone in a sea of my supporters. Trent was pacing frantically near the bar, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. He looked like a trapped animal. He kept pulling out his phone, typing furiously, and then putting it away again. There was no one he could call to fix this. His money and his status were completely useless against the ironclad legal authority I held in my hand. Elijah had retreated to a corner, leaning heavily against the wall with his hand covering his face. The powerful real estate mogul had been reduced to a humiliated old man hiding from the consequences of his own arrogance. He had promised to bankrupt me, but now he was the one being publicly evicted from the crown jewel of Atlanta high society. Julian, however, was completely broken. He slowly pushed himself away from the marble pillar and took a tentative step toward me. "Gabby, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "You cannot do this. My managing partner just fired me. If you kick us out with the police, everyone in the city will know. My career will be completely over. We can sit down and talk about this. We can go back to the original venue. I will pay for it. I will do whatever you want. Just please call off the sheriff and let my family stay. Do not embarrass us like this." I looked at the man I had almost married. He was sweating, his tuxedo jacket rumpled, his eyes wide and desperate. He was not apologizing for his mother stealing my money. He was not apologizing for telling me to stop acting like I was from the projects. He was only apologizing because he had lost his power, and he was terrified of the consequences. "I am not embarrassing you, Julian," I replied softly, my voice carrying just enough for him and his mother to hear. "You embarrassed yourselves. You chose to treat me and my family like we were beneath you. You chose to let your mother hijack our wedding because you were too much of a coward to stand up to her. I am just holding up a mirror so everyone can see exactly who you are." Vanessa rushed over and grabbed Julian's arm, trying to pull him away. "Do not beg her," Julian, Vanessa cried, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "She is a monster. She planned this all along to ruin us. Let us just go. We do not need to be in this trashy place anyway." The sheriff and his deputies began moving through the room, taking steps toward the family. "It is time to go, folks," the sheriff said firmly, gesturing toward the exit. "Do not make me ask you again. I will start putting people in handcuffs if I have to." The threat of actual physical arrest finally pierced through their lingering entitlement. Elijah pushed off the wall and walked toward the door without looking back, his head bowed in complete defeat. Trent followed behind him, practically sprinting to get away from the police. Vanessa dragged Julian by the arm, pulling him toward the exit, while he looked back at me with a pathetic expression of deep regret. The lobby was rapidly emptying out, leaving behind a trail of abandoned champagne flutes and discarded dignity. Elijah had already disappeared through the heavy mahogany doors, and Vanessa was aggressively pulling a sobbing Julian out into the cold afternoon air. But Vivian did not move. She stood planted in the center of the marble floor, her expensive silk suit now wrinkled, her perfectly styled hair beginning to fall out of its pins. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she looked around at the empty space where her high society empire used to be. The sheriff and two of his deputies approached her, gesturing politely but firmly toward the exit. "Ma'am, it is time to leave." The sheriff said, his voice calm but brooking no argument. "Your party is over. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Vivian slapped the deputy's hand away with a vicious strike. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She had completely lost her mind. The polished, composed matriarch of the family had been replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. She turned her wild eyes toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you have won?" she screamed, taking a staggering step in my direction. "You think you can just march in here with a piece of paper and throw me out of my own event? I belong here. I am a founding member of this community. You are nothing. You are just a girl from the West End who got lucky." My Uncle Charles stepped forward to shield me, but I put a hand on his shoulder and gently moved past him. I wanted to look Vivian in the eyes as she completely self-destructed. "You are right, Vivian," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "I am a girl from the West End. But the difference between you and me is that I built my life with my own two hands. You built yours on lies and stolen money, and right now your lies have run out. The sheriff is losing his patience. Leave before he puts you in handcuffs. The threat of handcuffs should have sobered her up, but Vivian was too far gone. Her ego could not process the humiliation of being evicted by the very woman she had tried to erase. She stomped her foot on the marble floor like a petulant toddler. "I am not leaving," she roared, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I paid for this room. I paid for the catering. I paid for the string quartet. You cannot kick me out when I bought this space fair and square. I paid $100,000 to secure this club today. $100,000 of your canceled wedding deposit went straight into the Heritage Club bank account. I bought this venue with your money, Gabby, so legally, it is my event." The words hung in the air, suspended in the sudden absolute silence of the lobby. My family stared at her in shock. The remaining club staff froze in their tracks. Even the sheriff stopped reaching for his radio, his eyes widening as he processed what she had just screamed at the top of her lungs. Vivian, in her blind, desperate attempt to assert her dominance, had just publicly confessed to stealing my money. She had admitted to taking the $150,000 deposit from the Piedmont estate and using a massive chunk of it to fund her own private society party. She thought the money gave her ownership, but she had just handed law enforcement a verbal confession of grand theft and wire fraud. I looked at the sheriff, raising one eyebrow. "Did you catch that, Sheriff?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. The sheriff nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a look of absolute professional disgust. "Loud and clear, Mrs. Hayes," he replied, unclipping the handcuffs from his heavy utility belt. Vivian suddenly realized what she had just done. The frantic adrenaline drained from her face, leaving behind a sickening pale white. She looked at her hands and then looked at the sheriff, who was now advancing on her with purposeful strides. "Wait," she stammered, taking a step backward. "No, that is not what I meant. I transferred the funds on behalf of Julian. It was a family transaction. It is not a crime. You cannot arrest me." But before the sheriff could grab her wrist, a new sound pierced through the heavy oak doors. It was not the wail of police sirens this time. It was the heavy grinding screech of large vehicles coming to a sudden halt on the cobblestone driveway outside. The thick glass panes of the front entrance were suddenly illuminated by a blinding wash of bright white halogen lights. The strobing police lights had been replaced by the unmistakable glare of professional television floodlights. Through the glass doors, the remaining people in the lobby could see 4 massive news vans pulling right up to the front steps, blocking the exits. The sides of the vans were emblazoned with the bold logos of CBS Fox, ABC, and the biggest local news affiliate in Atlanta. Doors flew open, and camera operators began sprinting up the stone steps, balancing heavy broadcasting equipment on their shoulders. Reporters in sharp suits were right behind them, holding microphones and urgently directing their crews to get the best angles. Vivian stumbled backward, putting a hand to her throat. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it looked like she had just seen a ghost. The media was her ultimate nightmare. In her world, a quiet arrest could be swept under the rug with expensive lawyers and sealed documents. But a public broadcast, a live television circus, was a death sentence. She turned to me, her lips trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion outside. I checked my mental timer. Exactly 30 minutes had passed since Trent tossed that ripped-up check onto the hood of my limousine. I smiled a cold, calculated smile that promised absolute ruin. "I told Trent I was going to make this a grand finale, Vivian," I replied, gesturing toward the incoming flood of reporters. "You see, when you cancel a wedding for a woman who runs the top crisis public relations firm in the state, you should probably expect her to invite her own media contacts to the reception. I called them 30 minutes ago. I told them that the prominent Vivian and her hedge fund manager's son-in-law were involved in a massive financial scandal right here at the Heritage Country Club. I promised them an exclusive story. And you just gave them a beautiful confession right on cue." The heavy mahogany doors were thrust open, and the reporters flooded into the lobby, the bright camera lights washing over Vivian's terrified face. I could hear them shouting questions immediately, asking about the stolen wedding funds, asking about Trent Hedge Fund, asking if the rumors of the Heritage Country Club going bankrupt were true. They were relentless because I had fed them exactly the right breadcrumbs to make this the biggest scandal of the year. My family stood behind me, watching in awe as the woman who had tormented me for years was completely swallowed alive by the media machine she had always tried to control. My Uncle Charles let out a low whistle of pure respect. My sister squeezed my hand, a massive grin on her face. The sheriff just stood there holding his handcuffs, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the masterpiece of destruction I had orchestrated. Vivian tried to cover her face with her designer clutch, but the cameras captured every single tear, every single panicked sob. The little red recording lights on the massive lenses blinked steadily, broadcasting her downfall in high definition. She was trapped. The elite society friends who had fled were probably already watching this on their phones in their luxury cars. The humiliation was complete and total. The trap had not just closed around her, it had broadcast her demise to the entire world, and the real show was finally going live. The reporters flooded the lobby with a chaotic energy that completely shattered whatever remained of the country club pristine atmosphere. Thick black cables snaked across the marble floors, and the blinding glare of the camera lights illuminated every corner of the room. Microphones from every major local network were thrust forward, forming a tight circle around the center of the conflict. Vivian tried to shrink back into the shadows, holding her designer clutch over her face, but there was nowhere left to hide. The camera operators were ruthless, angling their lenses to capture her ruined makeup and the absolute terror in her eyes. Trent threw his hands up in front of a lens, shouting at a cameraman to back off and threatening to sue the network. But his threats sounded hollow and desperate. He looked exactly like what he was, a guilty man caught in the spotlight. I watched the media frenzy unfold for a few seconds, letting the chaos peak. In my line of work, timing is everything. You have to let the scandal breathe just enough to capture the public attention before you step in and seize control of the narrative. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my Vera Wang gown, and stepped directly into the blinding circle of light. The reporters immediately shifted their focus to me. They saw a bride in a custom dress standing in the middle of a disaster zone, and they smelled blood in the water. Questions were fired at me from every direction, overlapping in a deafening chorus. I raised one hand, a simple, calm gesture of authority that I had used in 100 press conferences before. The seasoned reporters recognized the posture of a professional, and the shouting quickly died down into an eager, expectant silence. "Good afternoon, Atlanta," I said, looking directly into the lens of the closest camera. My voice was steady, carrying the polished cadence of a woman who was entirely in her element. "My name is Gabby Hayes. I am the founder and lead director of the Hayes Crisis Management Group. Many of you know my firm from the corporate restructuring cases we handled downtown last year. But today, I am not here representing a client. Today, I am speaking to you as a bride who arrived at her wedding venue this morning only to find the gates chained shut and her life savings stolen by the very people she was about to call family." I paused, letting the weight of my words transmit through the lenses and into the living rooms of thousands of viewers. A murmur rippled through the press pool. They had come expecting a story about a country club dispute, but I was handing them a prime-time soap opera wrapped in a white-collar crime. I turned my body slightly, gesturing toward the corner where Vivian and Trent were backed against the wall. Behind me, the sheriff and his deputies stood by, watching the broadcast unfold with grim expressions. "The woman hiding behind her purse is Vivian," I continued, my tone shifting from professional to sharply poignant. "She was supposed to be my mother-in-law. The man standing next to her, shouting at your crew, is Trent, her son-in-law and the manager of a local hedge fund. Earlier this week, Vivian forged documents to cancel my wedding contract at the Piedmont estate. She withdrew my $150,000 deposit without my knowledge or consent. And as you all just heard her confess in front of law enforcement, she used that stolen money to fund this private, unsanctioned party right here at the Heritage Country Club." Camera flashes went off like rapid gunfire, illuminating Vivian's face as she let out a muffled sob. A reporter from the local CBS affiliate thrust a microphone forward, asking why a wealthy family would steal from their own daughter-in-law. I smiled a sad, knowing smile that conveyed perfectly calibrated emotional restraint. They did it because I did not fit their aesthetic, I answered, looking straight into the camera again. I grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of the West End. I built my business from the ground up with the support of my beautiful, loud, hard-working black family who are standing right behind me. But to Vivian and Trent, my family was an embarrassment. They decided that my relatives were not refined enough to mingle with their corporate friends. So they stole my money, locked my family out, and relocated the wedding here, intending to have a private ceremony with only their elite social circle. The reporters eagerly scribbled on their notepads. The narrative was irresistible. It was a story of class warfare, racial prejudice, and old money arrogance colliding with self-made resilience. I was painting a masterpiece of public destruction. I did not have to shout or act hysterical to make my point. My absolute calm was the most damning evidence against them. I was standing in a high society lobby in a ruined wedding dress, calmly dismantling an empire, while the supposedly refined elite acted like cornered criminals. They assumed I would be too ashamed to fight back. I said, my voice ringing with quiet power. They thought because they have country club memberships and hedge funds, they could use the police to silence me when I showed up to claim what was mine. Less than 10 minutes ago, Trent called 911 and falsely reported a hostile mob of black trespassers, hoping the sheriff would arrive and arrest my family. He tried to weaponize the law to cover up his mother-in-law theft. Another shockwave went through the press pool. The reporters immediately turned their cameras to the sheriff, who nodded grimly, confirming the false police call. Trent's face went completely white. He realized I had just broadcast his racist attempt at police intimidation to the entire city. His hedge fund investors were undoubtedly watching. His corporate partners were watching. His entire professional life was evaporating on live television. I had taken the weapons they used to oppress people like me and turned them into a media guillotine. But I was not quite finished. The wedding deposit was just the appetizer. As a crisis manager, I knew you had to save the most devastating blow for the end of the broadcast. I took a step closer to the cameras, preparing to deliver the financial kill shot that would ensure none of them ever recovered. I reached back into my white silk clutch and pulled out a second manila folder. This one was thicker than the first, and it did not have a red state registry stamp. It had the sharp black logo of a forensic accounting firm. The reporters instantly leaned in closer, their microphones practically brushing against my gown. The only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of camera shutters. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution printed bank statements. I told you that Vivian stole my $150,000 wedding deposit, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, and she just confessed to using it to pay for this country club event. But that was only half the truth. Vivian did not just cancel my wedding because she hated my family. She canceled it because she was desperate and she needed liquid cash to cover up a federal crime. I held up the first bank statement, turning it so the cameras could clearly capture the highlighted account numbers. For the past 5 years, Vivian has served as the chairperson of the Trinity Hope Foundation, a charity organized by her church to provide housing assistance for underprivileged families in the West End, the very neighborhood she claims to despise. The reporters furiously took notes. Stealing from a church charity was the kind of headline that ended lives. It was the ultimate betrayal of public trust. 6 weeks ago, I continued flipping to the next page. Trent Boutique Crypto Hedge Fund suffered a catastrophic collapse. He had been running a highly illegal commingled fund, and he lost over $4 million of his investors' money overnight. The Securities and Exchange Commission started asking questions. Subpoenas were being drafted. Trent was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud and securities violations. He went to his mother-in-law for a bailout, but Vivian did not have $4 million in liquid assets. So she did what any respectable high society matriarch would do. She stole it from the poor. A loud collective gasp echoed from the press pool. Behind the cameras, my family stood in stunned silence. The sheer depravity of stealing from a housing charity to bail out a fraudulent crypto bro was almost too much to comprehend. I pointed directly at the highlighted lines on the bank statements. Vivian used her executive access to drain exactly $4.2 million from the Trinity Hope Foundation. She wired it directly to Trent offshore accounts to temporarily balance his books and keep the SEC investigators off his back. Vivian let out a strangled wail, sliding down the marble wall until she collapsed onto the floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically, but nobody moved to help her. Trent looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes were darting frantically toward the front doors, but the sheriff deputies had already moved to block the exits. There was no escape for either of them. Their wealth and privilege could not shield them from the cold, hard evidence printed in black and white. But Vivian had a major problem. I said, keeping my pace deliberate and relentless. The church board had scheduled an independent audit of the charity fund for next Monday. She needed to put the money back before the auditors realized the accounts were empty. She tried to leverage her own assets, but her credit was overextended. She was out of options and running out of time. And then she remembered that her name was listed as the primary financial contact on a $150,000 wedding deposit at the Piedmont estate. I handed a few copies of the statements to the lead reporters in the front row. They immediately began scanning the pages, their eyes widening as they verified the wire transfers. She canceled my wedding contract, I explained, watching the realization wash over the faces of the press. She took the $150,000 and wired it directly into the church charity account, hoping it would be enough to stall the auditors. But she still needed a cover story. She needed a reason for why the wedding was suddenly moved. So she called in a few favors and booked this room at the Heritage Country Club on credit, pretending it was an exclusive upgrade. She thought she could hide her embezzlement behind a veil of snobbery. I continued, my voice projecting over the hum of the camera equipment. She thought she could blame my family for being too unrefined and use that as the perfect excuse to downsize the wedding and hide the missing funds. She wanted to play the victim of a chaotic daughter-in-law while secretly functioning as a white-collar criminal. The sheer audacity of the scheme was laid bare for the entire city to see. The cameras zoomed in on Vivian, who was now rocking back and forth on the floor, a broken shell of the arrogant woman who had tried to destroy me just an hour ago. Trent was hyperventilating, clutching his chest, as the reality of his impending federal indictment crashed down on him. He had tried to weaponize the police against a group of innocent black people to protect a fortune that did not even exist. He wanted my family in handcuffs so nobody would notice that he was the one who belonged behind bars. "You called the police today, Trent," I said, looking right at him while the cameras followed my gaze. "You wanted the authorities to come and clean up your mess. You wanted them to arrest innocent people to maintain your pathetic illusion of superiority. Well, they are here. And thanks to these bank statements, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission will be knocking on your door by Monday morning." The reporters exploded into a frenzy of shouted questions trying to get a statement from Trent or Vivian. The flashes of light were blinding, capturing every angle of their complete and total ruin. The sheriff stepped forward, his face a mask of furious determination. He had been used as a pawn in their racist game, and he was not going to let them walk away quietly. He instructed his deputies to secure the lobby, telling Trent that he was being detained for questioning regarding the fraudulent emergency call and the financial documents I had just provided to the press. I stood in the center of the chaos, feeling a profound sense of closure. The crisis had been managed. The narrative was permanently set. I had taken the worst day of my life and turned it into a masterclass of absolute justice. My family, the people they had tried to lock out and erase, were standing tall and vindicated, while the so-called elite were crumbling in the dirt. I turned away from the cameras and the screaming reporters, knowing that my work here was finally done. The lobby of the Heritage Country Club was completely unrecognizable from the quiet, sophisticated space it had been just an hour earlier. The reporters were shouting over each other, thrusting microphones toward Vivian, who was still curled on the marble floor, and Trent, who was now physically backed into a corner by the sheriff deputies. The bright camera flashes strobed relentlessly, capturing the total annihilation of their public image. The remaining 50 elite guests who had lingered to watch my supposed arrest were now stampeding toward the coat check and the side exits. They held their hands over their faces using their expensive suit jackets and designer scarves as shields against the blinding camera lights. Their loyalty to Vivian was non-existent. The only thing they cared about was ensuring their own faces did not end up on the evening news associated with an embezzlement scandal and a federal fraud investigation. They pushed and shoved their way out the door, leaving their former friends completely abandoned. Trent was breathing heavily, his expensive suit disheveled. He tried to push past a deputy, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "You cannot hold me here," he demanded, looking wildly at the sheriff. "I want my lawyer. You have no jurisdiction over federal financial matters. I know my rights." The sheriff stepped forward, his expression stoic and unyielding. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are right, Mr. Sterling," the sheriff said calmly. "I do not handle securities fraud, but I do handle filing false police reports and misusing emergency services. You are being detained while we contact federal authorities regarding the documents Mrs. Hayes just provided. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Trent's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked toward Elijah, hoping the powerful patriarch would step in and use his influence to save him. But Elijah was currently putting on a performance of his own. Realizing the sheer magnitude of the public disaster, Elijah suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in exaggerated agony. He let out a loud, dramatic groan and slumped against the mahogany bar, sliding down to the floor. "My heart," he gasped loudly, ensuring the nearest cameras could hear him. "I cannot breathe! Call an ambulance!" It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to deflect media attention away from the criminal allegations and paint himself as a victim of sudden medical distress. I stood completely still, watching the chaotic theater unfold. My crisis management training kept my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a profound sense of vindication. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, and now they were the ones rolling on the floor begging for mercy. The reporters barely gave Elijah a second glance, recognizing the fake heart attack for exactly what it was, a desperate diversion tactic. They kept their lenses trained on Trent as the sheriff secured the handcuffs around his wrists with a loud metallic click. That was when Julian finally broke. He had been standing frozen near the floral arrangement, watching his entire life disintegrate piece by piece. He had lost his job at the prestigious law firm. His brother-in-law was in handcuffs. His mother was exposed as a thief and a fraud. And the woman he had treated like a disposable accessory was the one holding the match that burned it all down. Julian stumbled forward, his face pale and streaked with sweat. He did not care about the cameras anymore. He did not care about his carefully curated aesthetic or his desperate need to appear superior. He collapsed right in front of me, dropping heavily to his knees on the cold marble floor. "Gabby, please," he sobbed, his voice raw and broken. "Please make it stop. Tell them to turn the cameras off. I am begging you. You proved your point. You destroyed us. Just please tell them to leave." He reached out, grabbing the hem of my custom Vera Wang gown, his hands shaking violently. He looked up at me with eyes full of pathetic, desperate terror. I looked down at the man who was supposed to be my husband. The man who had stood by silently while his family mocked my roots. The man who had told me to stop acting like I was from the projects. He was kneeling at my feet, begging for the very mercy he had refused to show me just 30 minutes ago. I did not feel angry anymore. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. I gently but firmly pulled the silk fabric of my dress out of his grasping hands. "I did not destroy you, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but carrying enough weight to slice through the chaotic noise of the room. "Your mother destroyed you when she stole from a charity to fund your arrogant lifestyle. Trent destroyed you when he tried to weaponize the police against innocent people. And you destroyed yourself when you chose to protect their lies instead of standing by the woman who built you up." He let out a ragged sob, burying his face in his hands. I did not know he choked out tears spilling through his fingers. "I swear I did not know about the stolen money or the hedge fund. Mother just said she upgraded the venue." "I was stupid, Gabby. I was so stupid. Please, you have to believe me." I looked at him, feeling a deep sense of finality. It does not matter what you knew, Julian, I replied, stepping back so there was a clear physical distance between us. What matters is what you did when you thought I was powerless. You thought I was just a girl from the West End who would quietly accept being locked out of her own life. You forgot that I am the one who writes the narrative. The camera flashes continued to pop, capturing the image of the ruined golden boy kneeling before the woman he had tried to erase. The sheriff deputies were actively escorting a handcuffed Trent out the front doors, pushing past the throng of shouting reporters. Vivian was still huddled on the floor, entirely broken. The collapse of their toxic empire was absolute. There were no lawyers or PR spin doctors who could save them from the reality they had created for themselves. The truth was out, and the consequences were unfolding in real time on live television. The final act of this tragedy was drawing to a close, and I was ready to drop the curtain. I looked down at Julian for the very last time. He was still kneeling on the cold marble floor, his shoulders shaking as he wept for the sudden violent loss of his privileged life. Next to his knee, resting on the edge of a low marble table, sat a crystal champagne flute he had abandoned when the police first arrived. The expensive champagne had long since gone flat. I raised my left hand and looked at the 3-carat diamond engagement ring glittering under the harsh glare of the television lights. It was a beautiful stone, heavy and flawless, but it represented a promise that was entirely hollow. It was a symbol of the cage they had tried to lock me in. Slowly, I slid the heavy platinum band off my finger. Julian looked up, his eyes wide and pleading, silently begging me not to do it. He reached out a trembling hand, but he did not dare touch me. I held the ring directly over his abandoned glass and let it fall. It hit the crystal with a sharp, definitive clink, sinking quickly to the bottom of the flat champagne. I am not just calling off the wedding, Julian, I said, my voice completely devoid of the warmth he had spent years taking for granted. I am firing your whole family. I turned my back on him without waiting for a response. I did not need to hear another pathetic apology or another cowardly excuse. I looked at my Uncle Charles, my sister, and the 240 people who had stood by me with unwavering grace through the most chaotic hour of my life. Let us go celebrate, I told them, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. We walked out of that country club lobby as a united, beautiful front. The reporters parted for us, their cameras capturing the powerful image of a black family walking away from a shattered institution of white arrogance. We stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the screaming, the handcuffs, and the flashing police sirens entirely behind us. The fleet of luxury charter buses was waiting right where we left them, their heavy diesel engines idling smoothly in the crisp autumn night. We did not drive back to the West End. Instead, the caravan of buses navigated through the glowing streets of downtown Atlanta, pulling up to the glittering grand entrance of the St. Regis Hotel. Earlier that morning, when I first discovered Vivian had locked me out of the Piedmont estate, I made one phone call to a billionaire tech CEO whose company I had saved from a massive data breach scandal the previous year. He owed me a monumental favor, and he delivered beyond my wildest expectations. He had rented out the entire rooftop penthouse of the hotel, completely covering the cost of top-tier catering, a live jazz band, and a premium open bar. It was no longer a wedding reception. It was an independence party. Walking onto that rooftop overlooking the breathtaking Atlanta skyline, surrounded by the people who genuinely loved and respected me, I felt a massive weight lift off my chest. The air up there felt incredibly clean. My aunts kicked off their heels and danced on the polished wood floor. My cousins toasted to my freedom with top-shelf liquor. The food was incredible. The music was vibrant, and there was absolutely no one in that room who thought we did not belong. We owned the night. It has been over a year since that day, and the dust has finally settled. The justice system moved surprisingly fast when the crimes were broadcast in high definition on live television. Trent was convicted of wire fraud and embezzlement. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, and Vanessa filed for divorce the exact moment his offshore assets were frozen. Vivian barely avoided jail time by liquidating absolutely everything she owned, including her primary residence, to pay back the church charity. But the social execution was absolute and permanent. She was permanently banned from the Heritage Country Club, excommunicated from her church, and entirely shunned by the Atlanta elite she had sacrificed her soul to impress. She now lives in a tiny rented apartment far outside the city limits, too ashamed to ever show her face in public. As for Julian, his legal career never recovered. No corporate law firm would ever touch an associate who lied on his state bar application and was publicly tied to a massive financial fraud scandal. The last I heard, he was working as an overworked, underpaid public defender in a rundown office 3 counties over, struggling to pay his own rent without his mother money to fall back on. He finally got the life of hard work he always thought he was too good for. They tried to lock me out because they thought I was desperate for a seat at their table. They thought my love for Julian would make me swallow my pride and abandon my roots. But they forgot that when you build your life with your own 2 hands, you do not need permission to sit down. You just build a bigger table. I spent 2 years trying to shrink myself to fit into a family that was violently committed to misunderstanding me. I thought my professional success and my financial stability would eventually earn their respect. But true respect is not something you should ever have to buy or negotiate for. If someone requires you to abandon your history, your family, or your dignity just to be loved by them, then they do not love you at all. They just love the control they have over you. Walking away from Julian was the most painful decision I ever had to make, but it was also the most profoundly empowering. I chose myself. I chose my family. And in doing so, I protected the legacy of the people who raised me in the West End. I proved that our worth is not dictated by country club memberships or old money aesthetics. Our worth is inherent and it is untouchable. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace? Have you ever had to stand up to people who completely underestimated your worth and tried to make you feel small? I would really love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sharing our experiences is how we heal, and how we remind each other that we are never alone in these battles. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, boundary setting, and taking back your absolute power. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that their roots are a source of immense strength, not shame. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your peace, your dignity, and your independence are always worth fighting for.